at Chapman College, Scripps, and Claremont Graduate University, and now is serving as Assistant Dean of Faculty at Pitzer College, where she also mentors first-generation college students and Native American students. She has done research on many other areas. I should have printed out your resume because it would take so long. But somehow along the way, she's authored articles and books, some with her husband, Eric Hurley, who teaches at Pomona College. And she's given scores of presentations in Russia, in Williams College in Massachusetts, in Hawaii, and her family includes 2 daughters, one in nursery school and one in elementary school. So she has a busy, busy life, and we're fortunate to have her with us tonight. Thank you, Shelva.
Thank you, Charlene, for a very warm introduction. And thank you for having me tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my thoughts regarding the experiences of South African women in pre- and post-apartheid South Africa. Before we start our conversation tonight, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the topics I may want to just touch on as we have a conversation tonight. I will start off by just speaking about the educational experiences of various groups within South Africa. Then just focus a little bit on the women's movement in South Africa, and then just a couple of key points regarding the gendered experiences of women, regarding reproductive health, implementation of our constitutional law, and then women and their socioeconomic status in South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa. When you speak about transformation in South Africa, you really can't separate conversations of race and gender, or race and socioeconomic status, or race and geographic location, or race and language, because during the apartheid era we were really classified, and our experience in the system was really embedded in our racial classifications. So in South Africa we have 4 racial groups: white, Asian or Indian, black, and colored. Right? So colored is a racial term that I think is foreign to a lot of people, but I'm a colored person. And colored people are of mixed ancestry, so when I did my DNA analysis, I had roots in Congo, in Southern Africa, in Mali, in East Asia, in South Asia. So I really, when you think of the colored people, think of them as a group of people who have mixed ancestry. However, they've been marrying each other for many generations, and so they have a unique culture, they have a unique language, and so the apartheid government really classified us separate from all the other groups. And so the South African government really came up with this way of classifying people. So that's a picture of me at the age of 2. I was cute, right? So this is a picture that appeared in the local newspaper. There was an event happening at my daycare, and so the local newspaper came and took this picture. I was born in Potchefstroom, which is about 100 miles away from Pretoria. And Pretoria is very significant because that's the town that the Dutch settlers decided would be their capital city within South Africa when they settled in South Africa. So that's the place they selected. That's where a lot of the conversations happened around strategizing regarding apartheid policies. And so I was very aware. I was born 11 years before apartheid ended, so I was very aware of these things happening, protests happening, and so forth. Like most of our major cities in South Africa, they were all separated into 4 areas. So the white people lived separate from the black people, from the Indian people, and from the colored people. So we were not allowed to interact with one another. We had separate schools, we had separate hospitals. For a period, there were designated times by which we could go into town to do shopping. So they wanted us to spend our money in the white downtown area, but they only wanted us there, certain times of the day. So I did not really interact with people from other racial groups until I started high school, which was 1996. So we were very segregated in our experiences there. So just to give you a little background in terms of the educational expenditure by the apartheid government. So the blue part of this chart shows you how much money the government spent on each student based on their racial classification. So for every 100 cents they spent on a white student, they spent 76 cents on an Asian student, they spent 49 cents on each colored student, and 19 cents on each black student, right? So you can see how there's a disproportionate representation in terms of governmental expenditure. And in the red part of this chart shows you each group's representation in the national population. So black people comprised about 79% of the population, whites were 8.5% of the population, Asians were 2.5%, and then colored people were 9% of the population. So you can see how this chart is really skewed in terms of how much money was spent on each student versus their representation in the population in general. And so if you look at the data in terms of higher education enrollment by population group, what you see 1958 to 2013, initially white people were enrolling in higher education at much higher rates compared to other groups. You can see colored and Asian people really not being represented until about 1983. What is significant here also is that up to 1983, the leading institutions in South Africa did not allow any people of color to enroll. So the University of Free State, the University of Potchefstroom, University of Pretoria, these schools did not even allow people of color to even enroll, so you were just rejected on GP. Two things to note is that although you see a jump around 1994, our educational system is very stratified, like everywhere else in the world. So people of color are usually tracked into lower tier institutions, and then also towards fields outside of the STEM fields, and I experienced that too in my own educational experience, which I'll share a little bit later. So the big question is, how are we doing in terms of women in higher education in South Africa? The good news is that you can tell if you look at the data from 2009 to 2015, you see that women are enrolling in higher education at a higher rate compared to men, which is great. This trend started around 2000, where you started seeing the graph, a gap developing between the enrollment for men and women. And so that's great news. We're doing great in that regard. But I was working on my dissertation, and one of the questions I was really interested in is, what is the profile of those students who make the transition from high school to college, right? And so 4 variables were really predictive of the educational experiences in students, and the main idea that stems from that is white women are the ones who are enrolling in higher education at a higher rate compared to other groups. So if you look at this chart, the characteristics that I have listed in the middle of that table are the positive traits or the positive identities that increase your chances of enrolling in higher education. So if you are white or Asian, you're more likely to go to college because you would be living in an area with more resources, where the schools are better equipped because of the legacy of apartheid. Language is a very strong predictor of higher education enrollment. All of our universities are in English medium or Afrikaans medium institutions. Even though we have 11 official languages, we have 9 African languages as official languages. All of our colleges and universities are English or Afrikaans. So if you are someone who speaks Xhosa or Zulu or Venda, you are automatically at a disadvantage because you will be able to enroll and be educated in your first language. Once again, gender, as I said, white females are most likely to go to college. And then another factor that emerged as significant was the previous classification of the school you are attending. So if you attend a school that was previously designated for whites only or Indian only, you are more likely to go to college because those schools have better resources, better teachers, and are located in better areas. So when you think of this idea that women are enrolling at higher rates it's important to keep in mind that this is very closely related to issues of language, issues of classification and geographic location within South Africa. So when I looked at my data, I noticed that there's a gap in higher education participation for white women and women of color when they graduate, and the gap kind of widens the higher you go. So at the master's level, it widens, and at the PhD level, it widens some more. So the gap, although we have more women enrolling in higher ed, the gap just widens between the various groups in South Africa. So I'm going to, one of my colleagues at Pitzer College, Roberta Espinosa, writes about this idea that people can serve as agents for change when it comes to the educational trajectory of their students. She speaks of the idea that she calls these pivotal moments, in that there are professors or teachers that can really help students advance their educational goals by playing very specific roles within their educational experience. So she says that there are certain conditions that need to be in place. So a high level of trust between the student and the faculty member. Also a faculty member who's very knowledgeable about the field and the requirements for transitioning. She speaks about the idea that these educators have to be advisors. They often become advocates or sources of resources for the students. Also that timing is very important. So it's very important for these pivotal moments to really happen very early on in your educational experience rather than later. And then finally, the intensity of these pivotal moments are very important because a once-off intervention may not be as effective as a prolonged bi-directional process between the faculty member and the student, right? So multiple interventions are important. So I was fortunate to have several such people in my life that I think really helped me overcome, and I have two of them in the audience. Dr. Perkins and Dr. Smith are present here. Two people that I think were pivotal moments in my educational experience. But these are people that I think really helped me overcome the gender bias in my own educational experience. The first person I don't have a picture of, but she was my grade 1 teacher, Juffrou Baard. And what happened is I was in an accident when I was 5 years old. So I was in hospital for like 2 months and then recovering at home for another 2 months. She came to my house every day and helped me go through the curriculum to really go through what they covered in class. It was not required of her to do that. And Professor Espinosa speaks of this idea that oftentimes people who serve as pivotal moments in your educational experience go beyond the job description. So they don't just function as teachers, they see a need and they address that need and they go beyond what's required of them. Dr. Groenewald, which is the picture in the corner here, was my math and physics teacher in high school. So I started high school in '96, 2 years after we were integrated, and I went to a previously whites-only high school. And the first 2 years of my educational experience at that school, the teachers were actively telling me, no math, do home economics. You know, they were because they were still the teachers that were following the narrative of the previous regime. I remember the computer science teacher would not enroll me in computer science. He was like, we don't have space, you know, that kind of thing. So some part of the faculty were actively discouraging me because of their gender bias and because of their racial bias to seek other courses. And he joined our faculty and was like, sure, you want to do physics? You can come and do physics. I was the only woman of color in that physics class. I was the only woman of color in the math class. And he was giving a real counter-narrative to what was happening at the school. And then in the corner over there, I have Laura Dunwell. She was the director of study abroad at the University of Cape Town. And then below her are Peter and Jill de Villiers, who were faculty members at Smith College when I came for study abroad. And they really helped me figure out how to navigate the liberal arts higher education context. And then, as I mentioned, Dr. Smith and Dr. Perkins are here with us tonight, capping me in the center picture there. They were really instrumental in my graduate experience at CGU. And if I have have to really think about what ties all these people together. I would say they're all feminists, so they're all very strong advocates for women's rights. It's really a big part of the work they do. But I think also, especially with my grad school experience, these pivotal moment people have the ability to kind of predict what skills I would need in the future for my educational path, and were able to create opportunities for me to develop those skills within that context and in that time. So they were able to use their knowledge of the system to really help me develop as a researcher, as a student, and as a teacher. And so that's what I think ties these people together in terms of how they help me overcome some of the gendered biases in our educational system. So we're going to switch gears a little bit right now and talk about the women's movement in South Africa and some of the women who played a significant role in our transition in South Africa. Oftentimes, when people speak of the apartheid struggle, they speak of women as if they were indirectly involved in the process. But when you really interview women like Winnie Mandela, who was there with Nelson Mandela on the day he was released, you become aware of the fact that they were actively and very directly involved in helping the opposition fight the apartheid regime, right? So oftentimes, a lot of people who write about the role of women in the struggle, a debate in the literature is how do you define a victim of the apartheid regime? Because the TRC defines it as someone who was kidnapped or who really suffered physically or emotionally. But there's no real way to quantify and think about the structural violence that some of these women experienced and the socioeconomic consequences of these challenges that they faced. And so right now in the literature, a lot of scholars are speaking of the psychological consequences and the socioeconomic consequences of the structural violence that some of our women faced during the struggle. These are some of the famous pictures from the women's movement in South Africa. So the first one in the corner over here is defined or is labeled or named Defiance in Soweto. And here we have a woman that's just decided that she's just going to be defiant to those people who are trying to get the people to move out of the area there in Soweto. On the other side, you have Albertina Sisulu, who's the wife of Walter Sisulu, who was really instrumental in developing the Freedom Charter in South Africa. The picture here at the bottom, this one was taken during the march on August 9th, 1956. And 20,000 women got together to protest the past laws that they were trying to implement to kind of regulate the movement of people of color between black and white neighborhoods. So they wanted black people to work in their neighborhoods, to clean and garden, but you had to come extra early to sign in and to be signed out and to get permission to be there. So they really tried to develop all these regulations. And then the final picture is really iconic because this picture really demonstrates that the women's movement in South Africa was really, it really crossed the racial divide. So all of our racial groups are represented in this picture of the Women's Federation of South Africa. The first woman would be a colored woman, the next one is a white woman, next one is a black woman, and the final one is Asian or Indian. So what that picture and the one above it really demonstrates is that the women's movement in South Africa really kind of crossed the racial divide. Even though it was apartheid was about separating the groups, the women's movement really kind of unified and brought our women together to fight a common cause. So post-apartheid South Africa, we've made a lot of progress in terms of just reproductive health and policies that support women in South Africa. So when you read the narrative regarding our National Health Bill, access to healthcare is really seen as a public good. So the main narrative is we need to give everyone access because a healthy person is a healthy society is a happy society. So access to healthcare is defined as a public good, right? We also have contraception available to women as young as the age of 12. Without getting consent, they can go to a local clinic and get access. And we also have very progressive laws in terms of providing specific help to very specific demographics within South Africa. So we have specific policies to support people living with HIV and AIDS, sex workers, LGBTI persons, migrant workers, and people who are differently abled. In that way, we are very progressive, in that at the constitutional level, we have developed policies that are geared towards supporting these different groups. However, if you look at other markers of health and health outcomes, this chart represents maternal death during birth. And what you see is that 35% of the women who die during delivery die of non-pregnancy related issues. You can see that 11% die because of pre-existing medical conditions. So about 46% of women who die during delivery die because of non-pregnancy related issues and ailments. And I think these data really show us that we have a lot of work to do in terms of providing women with the care they need outside of pregnancy, because we do give free health care to pregnant women and children under the age of 6. But maybe we should develop more policies to provide access to cover these other ailments prior to pregnancy. I think one of our iconic gender advocates is Caster Semenya. As South Africans, we're very proud of her for what she's achieved in terms of justifying the International Athletics Board. If you know her story, you know that she broke the 800-meter record by 2 seconds, and people started questioning, how can she be so fast? And the media and fellow competitors really scrutinized her, calling her less than a woman because she has elevated high levels of testosterone. And so for a while, they banned her from participating, and then also at some point suggested giving her suppressants to reduce her testosterone levels, right? And for about 2 years, she was fighting it and ultimately got the International Athletics Council to not impose these laws on her and other competitors who have high levels of testosterone naturally. So we're very proud of her in terms of just how she fought this battle and really advanced conversations about gender and gender equality in athletics. In terms of law, we have a scholar that does a lot of work regarding the experiences of women in implementing our constitution. So South Africa's constitution is seen as very women-friendly or female-friendly or pro-women. However, what Hames often discusses is this fact that we have a lot of policies in place, but sometimes women have a difficult time accessing the resources that are laid out in our constitution. And maybe I can share an example from my own experience. So by law in South Africa, pregnant women and children under the age of 6 have free access to health care. So when my youngest was 6 weeks old, we moved to South Africa. We did my husband's sabbatical in South Africa. So I wanted to use this benefit of free access so she could get her shots for free, and so we have free clinics in the different neighborhoods, and the clinics open at 6 o'clock, at 8 o'clock in the morning. But in order for you to really get served on that day, you have to be there at 6. Because if you come later than 6, you may not be seen because there are so many people and they're understaffed and they may not have the right number of people to serve you that day. So although by law we do have policies in place and by law we do get access to free healthcare, that doesn't often translate in practice because of lack of resources, because in some areas the clinics may be underserved or underperforming. And so Hames writes extensively about this idea that we do have a pretty progressive constitution, but oftentimes it's difficult to translate that in practice for women, especially underrepresented groups. And then finally, just in regards to socioeconomic status, women are about 30% poorer than men in South Africa, right? So on average, they earn about 30% less. And the interesting thing is, although our poverty level has dropped post-apartheid, the gender gap has widened. So the gap has gotten wider, even though our overall poverty level has dropped since the end of apartheid. So a lot of sociologists speak about the idea that we shouldn't just measure socioeconomic status by income, but we should think of overall well-being, right? So don't just think about how much money are women making, but how are they functioning, how are they doing well in society. And there are still factors that undermine the overall well-being of women in South Africa, and this is often tied to the fact that they don't get to own land as much as men, the fact that there is a gap in earnings, and so these and other factors really undermine the overall well-being from a sociological and psychological perspective. If I have to summarize a theme that I think kind of ties all these things together, this is a quote that a friend of mine posted on Facebook earlier this week, a white woman in South Africa. It was a very long post, but this, I think, the section is very relevant to what we're discussing. She says, "I'm bleeding this week, I'll be honest, for women and privilege. The privileges I have as a white woman that many black women don't. The privilege that I have as a South African citizen that my fellow Africans who aren't nationals don't. The privilege of having a voice that I can use that others don't. The privilege I have, ironically, to stand up for and against the privileges of men enjoy that women don't." Right? And so I think when you think of education, when you think of the law, South Africa has made a lot of progress in terms of providing access and providing people with the opportunities to really successfully navigate the system. However, it is still stratified within that population in that issues of race and language and culture are really strongly tied to the experiences of women in South Africa. So I didn't want to end on this, so I'm going to show you just a cute video that I like, that I've seen on Facebook recently. When I was in Swansea High School, like I said, the predominantly white high school, you would never have told me that there would be a time when there would be a mostly white school singing an African traditional song at the national choir competition that we have every year. And so when I see videos like this, I'm reminded that we are making progress. There is cultural integration. We are making a positive progress towards kind of mending the intercultural tension that we had during apartheid. So I'll play maybe 20 seconds and then we can have questions and answers. So thank you for your time.